written by Sir Klaus Moser, will be published on Monday. And from what we can reveal tonight, it's clear that it will set a powerful alternative agenda to the government's current policy, urging preschool education from the age of 3 and the replacement of A-levels. And all this comes on the night when the Education Secretary declares that A-levels are here to stay. He's even extending them, with yet another A-level for the very brightest. I'll be asking Mr. Patton why he won't yield to the pressure for broadening the range for 16-year-olds. And two leading educators help us contrast the alternative recipes. Also tonight, how strong is the strain of flu that's sweeping the country? And why is it so resistant to all that medical science throws at it? And the country's also being swept, if we're to believe those opinion polls, by a growing sense of disillusion at politics and all who practice it.
Disillusioned? Yes, well, I think I can safely speak for all of us when I say it's high time our politicians put their ideas up a bit and started acting responsibly for a change.
Two former Prime Ministers tell us why they believe the body politic is severely infected and there may be no cure.
I'm an optimist. I believe this is a passing phenomenon and it will change again, especially if not all the good young people like you decide to go into the media.
We talked to Lord Callaghan and Sir Edward Heath. Sir Klaus Moser is one of the country's leading educators. A couple of years ago, amid growing controversy over the government's education policy in England and Wales, he suggested a royal commission to look at the whole business. When the government said no, he set up his own and called it the National Commission on Education. Its report is out on Monday. It comes at a time when the government is shifting its spotlight to social policies like education. Back to basics is their cry, in schools as elsewhere. Far from replacing A-levels as Sir Klaus Moser would, the government wants to embed them even deeper in the fabric. So, let's look at the two alternatives. First, Samira Ahmed reports on Sir Klaus Moser's vision of the educational system the country needs.
Tell me how old you are.
Sir Klaus Moser is a man with a mission to improve educational standards in Britain. When the government rejected his plea 3 years ago for a royal commission on education, Sir Klaus raised £1 million in private backing and set up his own. Newsnight has seen a copy of the National Commission report, due out on Monday, which proposes nothing short of a radical rehaul of primary, secondary and higher education.
In all countries, knowledge and applied intelligence have become central to economic success and social well-being. The most serious shortcoming of education in the United Kingdom is its failure to enable not just a minority, but a large majority of young people to obtain as much from their education as they are capable of achieving.
On the day that John Patton announced a new A-level grade for high flyers, this report presents a vision to improve the experience of all school children. It's a vision that has strong support from educational specialists in some quarters.
The government want to modernise our education system by going backwards to the 1950s. This report says that the only way to modernise our education system is by looking forwards to the social and economic challenges of the next century. They want to invest in nursery provision, they want to ensure that at primary school children get basic literacy and numeracy, and they want to ensure that at the secondary level we have a system based on achievement and not on failure. That's a prospectus for the next century which I think will appeal to parents, to governors and above all to children themselves.
Some of the recommendations in the Moser report are already available. This private nursery in southwest London teaches a highly structured course to 3-year-olds. The catch is, of course, it's only available at a price. In 1972, the then Conservative government promised within 10 years to provide nursery education for 90% of 4-year-olds. Today, just 8% of under-5s have such provision. Yet a recent American study shows $1 spent on nursery education saves $7 spent later on dealing with the cost of crime and welfare benefits to those failed by the lack of early schooling. Good reason, says the Commission, for the government to make spending on nursery education the top priority.
At 4.5, when the children go on, they have learnt to socialise so that they can look after themselves and look out for each other and manage to mix with other children and adults comfortably and at ease. With the academic side, they've learnt their letters and reading and can be writing numbers and doing sums, very simple additional and subtractional sums with beads and rods.
Money is the key. To pay for better nursery education, the report insists the private sector must be prepared to pay more in other areas, particularly higher and tertiary education. And there are precedents. This City Technology College in Battersea has attracted a business park to build on its premises. But the principal admits there are risks.
I mean, it would be horrendous if a first-rate researcher had to stop researching to go around with a begging bowl, and I'm sure some of them already do. I know they do. I think it's necessary to have climate and what you might call a common language, which develops. It's happening in education. But yes, those who are good at it will get on. And the danger, of course, is that they then see that as more important than money than actually what they do. I mean, it's a fine balancing.
But radical ideas alone won't fix Britain's crumbling schools, where pupils lack basic equipment. And the Commission believes the government will have to hand out the cash, perhaps as much as £4 billion to tackle the problem. With funding always tight, though, the most pressing priority is the structure of the curriculum.
The British education system is designed to select an elite rather than educate a majority. And so we find that too many young people end up leaving school discouraged and thinking that education is not for them. Our system is weak fundamentally because it's divided. The promise of this report is to create a unified system so that every child can combine academic and vocational programs according to their own aptitudes and their own interests.
Our European neighbours have known that for years. Students in French schools, such as this lycée in London, study 9 subjects for the baccalaureate instead of just 2 or 3 for A-level.
They must have at least a minimal knowledge of subjects like literature, language and literature, philosophy, history, geography, sciences. And so when they leave school, they know what we call the basic elements that are important for the future life.
Despite the obstacles placed in its way, Mose's National Commission has produced a report that is radical, that demands a massive level of money, and it throws down the gauntlet to a government which says it believes in reform to improve the future of this nation's children.
Samira Ahmed on what Sir Klaus Moser will be recommending on Monday. Now, how does this contrast with John Patton's plans? He was offering a quite different emphasis tonight. The Education Secretary who arrived to make his speech in Worcester this evening didn't look too battered after what's been a very tough year for him.
Have a safe journey back to London. Hello.
He's battled with the teachers over tests, and he had to battle with illness for much of the summer. For the last couple of months, he's enjoyed a better press and seems to have won back some of the lost ground.
The foundations of Conservative policy had been laid down before John Patton came into office. So I guess he was put there to implement those policies, to bring them into place. Not a great innovator, but to make things work. I think the distinctive thing he's brought to the job is the emphasis on the moral dimension.
Hello there, sir.
Tonight in Worcester, Mr. Patton was to make his contribution to the moral theme of the Back to Basics debate by taking excellence as his theme. As if to preempt Monday's Commission report, he brushed aside those who were for scrapping A-levels or broadening their scope, but he did announce a new starred A grade for the brightest pupils.
GCE A-levels are here to stay. They have been a remarkable educational success story and a hallmark for quality and excellence, not just here in Droitwich and the schools around in Redditch and Worcester and wherever else, but throughout the world. They are one of the most valuable methods we have of testing academic ability.
A-levels weren't the only option. He stressed the importance of the new GNVQs, the so-called General National Vocational Qualifications, as an alternative.
But what we do want to do is to make entirely sure that we have the correct blend of academic and vocational qualifications. And I think this is the way forward. The common link will be high quality, which is why, if A-levels are to remain an internationally respected benchmark for excellence in education, we must keep them under review.
And no one in his audience or in the wider educational arena will deny that A-levels will remain in the spotlight. Whether Mr. Patton likes it or not, they will, as we've seen, be a major highlight of the Commission's report on Monday. Well, when I spoke to Mr. Patton earlier, I asked him whether, on reflection, he didn't regret the government hadn't granted Sir Klaus Moser's request for a proper Royal Commission to try and make sense of education policy. I'm afraid we haven't actually got our interview with Mr. Patton ready at the moment, so we're going to have to go on to our next story, and we'll come back to education just a little bit later in the programme. Something has got stuck in the system. Well, it's only 7 months now before the government has to face the voters at the European elections. They clearly think they're onto a winner with the new emphasis on social policy. Mr. Major was talking about crime again today and all that talk about back to basics. The problem is that, according to the polls at least, there seems to be almost nothing the politicians can talk about now that will restore the public's trust in them. Sue Cameron has been assessing the scale of the country's political malaise with the public, party activists, and 2 former prime ministers.
Well, this is Oliver Cromwell. He was the guy who really established the power of Parliament, as it were.
Westminster in the recess, and Labour's Tony Banks is giving a guided tour to some of his future voters. This group of East London schoolgirls find much to admire in the architecture, the Speaker's procession, and David Blunkett's guide dog. But they harbour no illusions about the politicians who work here.
I don't have a lot of faith. I don't really see them doing much for our country.
They should have more contact with us, then we could tell them what we generally think about what they're doing, but we don't have no contact with them.
When I do see them on TV, they're always arguing, and that's why all students say that politics is boring, because we basically don't know much about it. We hardly have any information fed back to us. I don't know. The whole process doesn't make sense to me.
Their scepticism reflects that of their elders, as some MPs are aware.
There is this enormous amount of frustration amongst the politicians and amongst the electorate. And I think this is very dangerous, because it seems to me that there's a lot of mutual contempt developing as between electorate and politicians. I get the feeling that they feel that we're not particularly radical. There isn't a great deal to choose between a Conservative government, a tired and clapped out Conservative government, and an opposition that, frankly, has shifted substantially to the right in policy terms.
In the eyes of the public, politicians today seem to rank somewhere between double-glazing salesmen and pond lice. The latest polling evidence indicates that MPs are less respected and less trusted than any other group, except journalists. Opinion polls also suggest that 91% of voters believe politicians spout the party line as opposed to telling the truth, and 75% think most MPs care more about keeping power than about the best interests of the nation. Of course, politicians have never been top of the popularity polls, but today faith in them seems to have hit a new low. The question is, why? What would the man who's come to speak for Middle England make of a political class that has one foot in the grave?
Well, it's hard to get excited about politicians when you see who's actually out there. You've got a Prime Minister who looks as if someone's forgotten to plug him in. And the most interesting thing about the leader of the opposition is his name. Just a few new ideas would be a start. It dawned on me the other day, the only thing that separates the 2 main parties now is that the Conservatives have got more hair. I mean, you can imagine, can't you? First signs of premature baldness in the front bench. Share prices will be wiped out across the board. I mean, what happened to the great leaders and men of business?
Many blame the politicians' fall from grace on the drying up of new policy ideas. Here in Leicester, the Labour Party tightened its grip on the city in the last general election. But for some Labour activists, such as Tony Smythe, a street cleaning supervisor, political success has brought little optimism and no inspiration.
There's a lack of any ideas, not just new radical ideas, they just don't have any ideas. All they do is they find out what is the current trend, jump onto it, for the sake of jumping onto it, they think it might gain them a few more votes. If they went back to the way they were before, where they were, you could identify with them and say, yes, I believe in that, they believe in it, then perhaps they would get somewhere, but they certainly won't win any elections or win any friends.
Fellow Labour activists are equally gloomy. Labour membership's fallen in Leicester in the last few years, reflecting the nationwide drop from over 1 million in the early 1950s to some 200,000 today.
When I came into the Labour Party, I firmly believed that this was the route to achieve those socialist goals, and certainly at the moment I'm disappointed because I cannot see much movement in that direction, any movement in that direction at all.
Lunchtime in the Conservative constituency of Loughborough, and it's clear that the Tory activists assembled here are suffering the same crisis of political faith as their Labour opposite numbers in Leicester.
We have an arrogance that leads to an unseemly retreat from policy when one has the impression that if there was a little bit wider consultation, maybe among backbench MPs, maybe amongst ordinary people, certainly ordinary members of the party which is in government, then maybe some of these issues simply wouldn't arise. Maybe there would be an awareness on the part of cabinet ministers that some of these things simply aren't going to work.
There were times when you could genuinely feel that if you passed a resolution at branch level and it got through to conference, that it would have an influence on party. All of those things have gone, and so members think, what's the point?
You begin to wonder whether there's a philosophy driving any politician other than the ability to either get in or remain in office.
Surely to have radical politics, you need radical politicians.
And we
if we go
have-
back to the
and we
point
don't have
of career men, and if they're just solely career men, then obviously you're not going to get any radical policies from them.
I think any government could get any bill through Parliament if it is seen to be fair. But when you take the poll tax, any man, the ordinary man in the street could see that it wasn't fair. And it was the same with the VAT on the fuel. It is hitting the poorest in the society and the people who need the most help. Again, it is unfairness, and people don't like unfairness.
There are people, Conservatives, who care. You know, we haven't, we don't own care as socialists. You know, there are lots of other people that care as well. And they can see elderly people in their wards and in their constituencies who are going to be absolutely devastated by these sorts of activities. And they don't want it. And they keep saying it. But they're not listened to. So that goes right across, I think, all the political parties.
Doesn't show the hypocrisy.
So the people say the politicians don't listen. But what of more specific policies? What worries the voters there?
How long have we been coming out of this bloody recession for now? Just wish that one day they'd all own up and say, actually, we haven't the faintest idea of how it all works. Yes, I know we keep going on about the recipe for sustainable growth and all that, but in actual fact, it's just complete gobbledygook. If I believe the Chancellor of the Exchequer actually bases his economic forecast on a piece of seed, if it's wet, he tells us everything's going to get better. And if it's dry, he still tells us everything's going to get better. I mean, they talk about Kenneth Clark and the 7 Wise Men. Get more sense out of the 3 Stooges.
The economy's long been the touchstone of political success, or more often failure. The British have grown used to seeing one economic crisis, such as that faced by the Conservative Ted Heath in 1973 when the miners' strike led to the 3-day week, give way to another economic crisis, such as the winter of discontent under Labour's Jim Callaghan.
But he would investigate the allegations.
Lord Callaghan and Sir Edward certainly faced public disillusion as they wrestled with the economic problems of the 1970s. But did they detect a similar dispirited public mood today?
The disillusionment is very wide. And I think it's in the overall context that we've had the worst recession since the Second World War. And people feel that the government hasn't been able to cope.
Do you, either of you, feel that whenever there is real trouble economically, when there's a recession, that people are always disillusioned, that it's just part of the economic cycle?
I don't think that's true looking at it historically, no. It's generally been thought, I think, that the Conservative Party in government is able to deal with economic problems of this kind, if there has been perhaps sometimes the party and the Labour Party. But now I think there's also a general feeling that the Conservative government hasn't been able to deal with these problems, and I think that makes it worse.
Lord Callaghan, is there a feeling that governments just can't cope in a way that wasn't true in the past?
Yes, I think that's true for basically because a lot of our problems which could be dealt with on a national basis in the past have now got to be solved internationally. Hence Europe. Hence the need for a gap agreement and so on. And I think that national governments, frankly, are being reduced in competence, in their competence to deal with these problems. They've got to be dealt with on a wider basis. Now, I think people understand this in some ways, intellectually or in their minds, but they don't like to give up the sovereignty that's associated with it. And this is one of the strains which results in us having a very uncertain society today.
The public is very anxious, to put it mildly, but also not very impressed by what members of Parliament and members of the government have shown up as doing themselves. Now, in this present situation, I find they're saying, well, the government is talking about imposing a particular morality on the public. Well, are they really the sort of people who ought to be imposing this morality? And that, again, leads to double talk and then contempt, really, for certainly a number of members of Parliament.
Although I think that we both agree that the problems that have to be solved are extremely difficult and can't always be solved in this country and by this government. Nevertheless, I don't expect Ted to agree with this for one moment, but I'm going to say it. Nevertheless, I do think this lot has been there too long. It is extraordinary that half the members of the Cabinet have never been in the opposition at all. They don't know what it's about. They don't know how to run Parliament in that sense. And I think a spell in opposition would do them a lot of good, and we'd seem a little less stale.
I'm not saying to my own party what Jim was saying. What I'm saying is you've only got to look as far as Canada and see what happened to the Conservative Party there, which was left with 2 seats only in the Parliament, to realise, well, you've got to do something about it.
So, disillusion with politicians is nothing new, but it does seem to go deeper today than it did in the past. So what's changed? Here's one difference. The politicians used to command greater respect from the public and from the party whips than MPs today. And was that because many of them had established their reputations, sometimes on the battlefield, sometimes in other walks of civilian life, before they arrived at Westminster. Today, in contrast, more and more MPs are career politicians with little or no direct experience of the outside world.
Most politicians today, the only thing they're interested in is getting elected, and then once they're in office, doing absolutely anything to hang on to their jobs. You talk about selling your soul to the devil, only in their case it's to the cheap whip. I wonder what they think the word integrity means. Probably it's some sort of aftershave. And of course, they all keep giving this guff about being in touch with the people and serving the community. Most of them wouldn't kiss their own baby goodnight, unless it was in a marginal constituency.
Hello, John.
Congratulations.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Come on in.
Hello, Angela. Nice to see you.
John Whittingdale's one of the new breed of career politicians. At the age of 32, he won a safe Tory seat. Before that, apart from a few months in a bank, his entire working life had been spent in the political offices of various ministers, including Prime Minister Thatcher. He says he keeps in touch with the concerns of ordinary people through his constituents, though even some of his most loyal supporters express some doubts about politicians.
Do you not feel that you are increasingly losing touch with the way the people are going, the way the people are thinking?
A lot of people do feel disillusioned with politicians and that they are out of touch. And I think that it is up to politicians to show that they are not. That is what I think.
John Whittingdale's a Eurosceptic who defied the government whips and voted against the Maastricht Bill on third reading. A courageous thing for an ambitious man to do. In the days when many MPs neither expected nor wished to be ministers, it was often easier to take an independent line.
I think that you have to think very long and hard before you decide to vote against the government, because, I am not arrogant enough to believe that people voted for me personally. They were voting Conservative on the basis of what the Conservative Party was putting before them at the last election. But on the other hand, there may be an issue where if you really feel strongly that you ought to vote in a particular way, that is not the way the government wants you to vote, and ultimately you have to follow your conscience.
Paddy Ashdown left the rarefied atmosphere of Westminster for several months this year to find out for himself what ordinary people thought. He attributes the disillusionment with politicians of all parties partly to the increase in career politicians and partly to the fact that MPs are often better at the Westminster system than at solving the public's problems.
There are far too many politicians who came into politics as a profession in short pants straight from school. I mean, for instance, how many politicians have been unemployed? In an era when unemployment and the experience of unemployment is almost the dominant factor in our economic current position. How many politicians have worked in youth work? How many politicians have worked on the shop floor? The answer is very few, and even fewer of our really senior politicians.
But are there no excuses for politicians becoming such a turn-off?
Well, the media aren't much help, are they? Political figures are either national heroes or raving loonies, depending which paper you buy. If there's not propaganda, it's some trumped-up scandal about a cabinet minister going to bed with an octopus or something. And you lot in television aren't any better with your snappy little sound bites. I mean, anything you don't like, you just cut out, don't you? You see what I mean? Of course, I know it's not easy, televising the House of Commons without it looking like a riot in strange ways.
Yet today, much of the real debate takes place outside the chamber, in front of the TV cameras.
Actually no story at all.
Labour Shadow Cabinet member Jack Straw has done a study which shows that today there's less serious reporting of Parliament and the so-called quality newspapers and much more reliance on TV soundbites.
People know less and less about what politicians are doing, although they think they know more and more. They see bits on the television of the most aggressive aspects of politics, namely Prime Minister's questions. They see very little else on the television. And at the same time, the serious reporting by the press of what goes on in Parliament has virtually collapsed.
You know, Ted, when I made my maiden speech as a young unknown man in 1945, I had 5 inches in a broadsheet newspaper with a photograph. Nobody would dream of reporting that maiden speech now in that sense. And I think, you see, it's because the television has largely taken over that role of Parliament, which is a great pity.
I've always been in favour of television in the House of Commons. I said 200 people in the gallery who see everything, hear everything. Very well, then why shouldn't the rest of the country see and hear everything now that it's possible? But the interesting thing is that members of Parliament are completely oblivious of television. And they don't recognise that when the public sees the way they really behave in the House of Commons, the public is really pretty sure.
If the media has added perhaps to the public sense of disillusion, it's not entirely, at least, the media's fault.
No.
You both said how things have changed since you went into the Commons. One of the changes, perhaps in the last 10, 15 years, is the rise of what are seen as career politicians.
I still am, asked by so many people, when should I come into the House of Commons? And I said, you must only come in when you can bring something to it. Don't come in as one who's due down at 23 or 25 or 28. You've got to have something that you can bring to the House of Commons which makes your presence worthwhile. That, I think, is absolutely fundamental as far as they're concerned.
When I first went into the House, there were people who were at the head of very large companies and businesses who thought it was worthwhile being a member of the House of Commons and were proud to be members of the House of Commons. Now I'm afraid that pride has disappeared, rather. And maybe it's because of the nature of the problems we have to deal with today. I don't know. But you see, after all, when we were the centre of a great empire, and we were, when we were people who won the war, a nation that had won the war, great events happened and passed through the House of Commons. The debates meant something. If we were discussing freedom for India, we were discussing the freedom for a subcontinent of 500 million people. Nowadays, the issues somehow that come in front of the House of Commons, maybe it's because of the presentation, seem so much smaller, in some ways rather meaner than they were in those days. But as I say, I'm an optimist. I believe this is a passing phenomenon. I'm sure that the centre of gravity will reverse. And if you were to have a great national crisis, Parliament would become the focus of the nation once again, and not the media.
You're an optimist, Sir Edward?
Oh, come on, Joe, come on.
Well, watching these changes, I can't see them being reversed. And how these people are going to develop if they carry on like this. There's got to be a major development which will bring about a change which we would like to see. And at the moment, it's not in sight.
That's right, I agree, it's not in sight. But I believe in the common sense of our people.
No idea of what it could be?
Well, it's, this is heresy of the worst kind. But in fact, 650 members of the House of Commons is far too many. Far too many. If the United States, nearly 300 million people, in a vast area, the most powerful country in the world, can run itself with a Congress of 435, then 650 for us is really quite a proportion. And that means you've always got 650 people clamoring to speak, clamoring to be on this, clamoring to make a fuss about something else. That makes it extremely difficult to deal sensibly with legislation. This is another thing about which people are disillusioned. They say, well, look, this is constantly changing. Even a Conservative government in power brings in a bill, and then a few years later, 3 or 4 years later, they're changing it all again. And I find this is one of the things which upsets people most. They say, we're constantly changing, we're constantly changing. Why? I spoke to a meeting of top businessmen in Manchester beginning of the summer, and one of them, chairman, said, you must ask your question quickly, we've got to finish, you see. And the chap got up and said, I don't want to ask him a question. Well, what do you want to do? I just want to tell him something. Well, then tell him. And so he said, I just want to tell him that when he goes back to London, will he kindly go to the Prime Minister and say, if things are working reasonably well, and nothing ever works perfectly, then for heaven's sake, leave it alone. That's a large number of people.
How did you vote on railway privatisation?
I was in China.
You were there?
Sue Cameron reporting. Now, let's get back to where we left off on the new debate on education that's being provoked by the report of Sir Klaus Moser's commission this coming Monday. Now, it will say that the government has got much of the emphasis in education wrong, that it should replace A-levels with a broader range of subjects, and that nursery school should be available to all at age 3. The Education Secretary, on the other hand, tonight said that A-levels were here to stay, and he even invented a new one called Starred A-level. When I spoke to Mr. Patton earlier, I asked him whether, on reflection, he didn't regret that the government hadn't granted Sir Klaus Moser's request for a proper Royal Commission to try and make sense of education policy.
No, I don't think, generally speaking, Royal Commissions are vehicles, except in exceptional circumstances, for the kind of rapid decision-taking that's needed as far as education's concerned. And I think a Royal Commission would have gone on for several years, and it would have delayed, I think, the levering up of standards, which not just the Conservative Party and the Conservative government have been banging on about, but also Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Schools, Professor Stuart Sutherland, in those notable reports of his recent weeks.
But the trouble is that you do have, don't you, a large number of educationists and experts of some weight, like Sir Klaus Moser, now saying that you've got your emphasis wrong.
Well, I have not got the slightest idea what not the Royal Commission, the Hamlin Commission, National Commission on Education, it's supported by Paul Hamlin's Educational Trust, is going to say on Monday. They haven't sent me a copy. As of tonight, I haven't seen one, so I don't want to speculate. And the last thing I want to indulge in either, and I won't do it tonight, and I won't do it next Monday if you ask me on again then, is soundbite politics. Moser lashes Patton, Patton lashes Hamlin National Commission and all the rest of it. I do want to have a serious debate. That's why I think the debate has already been very serious today of my proposals for A-levels.
Well, let's start with A-levels, and you said A-levels are here to stay, and you've even introduced a new A-star grade. But isn't this underlining what some educationists see as elitism and specialisation at the top level, where what matters is the lower level?
No, I think any 16-year-old these days is spoilt rotten for choice. They've got the A-level, and I'm adding the new A-star grade to that to recognise the real excellence at the top end. They've got the AS levels. 2 AS levels are meant to equal 1 A level. I think they're a bit plump AS levels. They need to be thinned down a bit to encourage more people to do them. They will give enormous breadth, a couple of A levels and 2 or 3 AS levels. Then we've also got the General National Vocational Qualifications, which are our new vocational A levels, accepted by Oxford and Cambridge, incidentally, and I'm speaking to it from the Oxford studios, as a valid entry qualification. So complete parity of esteem with A levels in the old sense. And lastly, there's the International Baccalaureate. Sixth formers have never had it so good. 30 years ago, when I was in the sixth form, we had the A-level and nothing but the A-level.
The worry of education is that A-levels are too narrow. Why don't you go, like just about all our counterparts in Europe and other parts of the world do, for a wider range of subjects at that level?
Well, there is the wider range, which I've just described rather accurately. And, for example, already in sixth forms and sixth form colleges, we've got about 1,000 sixth form colleges and sixth forms, offering now this year, only a few last year, the new General National Vocational Qualification, the new vocational A-level. That means that someone can do, for example, an A-level and a General National Vocational Qualification. There's all the breadth there, and it can be underpinned by AS levels. I mean, I think the blind need to see on this occasion what's there. I can understand how over the years people who don't like the A-level have got it into their mind that, oh, the A-level's there and it's elitist, but they just simply haven't recognised the changes that have happened in the last 2 years. They need to get up to date.
Now, how about resurrecting something that Klaus Moser is particularly keen on, that 20-year-old commitment to education for 3- and 4-year-olds? Why don't you go about putting the emphasis on that?
That was given by one of my predecessors, I understand, Mrs. Thatcher, early on in the 1970s. Since 1979, no party political broadcast now, I promise, but we have increased the amount of nursery provision in the country for 3- and 4-year-olds. It now stands at about 56%. There's also private provision, and there's the excellent work done by the preschool playgroups. I wouldn't at all mind more nursery provision coming along. I don't want to see children packed off into the sorts of places where it's just child care. I don't mind seeing more nursery provision, but we have to face the fact at the moment, the present economic situation, there isn't any money, and there cannot be, I think, any improvements in that area until we are producing more.
Well now, I'm joined by Professor Anthony Flew, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Reading, and Stephen Andrews, Head Teacher at Sandringham School, St Albans. Stephen Andrews, who's nearer getting the emphasis right? Is it John Patton or is it Klaus Moser?
From what I've heard, and obviously I've not read the report, I would say Klaus Moser is, insofar as we need a different educational provision to go into the 21st century. A-levels were only ever designed to enable the top 20% to gain entry to university, and it's an exam which to a certain extent is coming understandably to the end of its shelf life.
Is that right, Professor Flew? Do you think we're only concerning ourselves essentially with those at the top tier?
This seems to me totally wrong. This idea that you've either got to cater for the people who are not outstandingly bright or exclusively for one seems to me utterly wrong. Why shouldn't one do what John Patton wants to, try to cater for a wide variety of ability and interests? Why do you have, in order to cater for people who are not able or willing to do A-level, to abolish A-level? Why not think of, as John Patton is thinking of, providing plenty of alternatives for different tastes and abilities?
I think Tony's engaging in a bit of polemic, actually. I don't think that we get much further in this conversation by talking about abolishing and doing away with A-levels. What we're talking about is a more comprehensive range of educational opportunities that are thought through. John Patton talks about post-16-year-old students actually being spoilt for choice. I think to a certain extent they're confused by choice. And within a school like mine, the choice that's available actually at the moment up until just this year has resulted in A-levels or a resitting of GCSEs.
Well, let's be clear.
That's not been a choice.
He says they're spoilt rotten for choice because they've got A-levels, they've now got AS levels, they've got starred A-levels now, and they've got these general national vocational qualifications. Of course, they've also got he says, the international baccalaureate. Now, is that right or wrong?
I think it's unfair. We seem to be trapped in a method of approaching education which is being given from decades before, rather than thinking through progressively about the future. For example, I've mentioned that A-levels start at 16, therefore the very brightest students, and they've been, to a certain extent, quite successful. But in many ways, why can't we think about a 14 to 18 educational provision, which gets rid of that rupture at 16? For example, in this country, we talk about people staying on. In most other countries, they talk about people dropping out. It's a very different way of assessing the quality of education provision post-16. We ought to have massive numbers staying on until 18. And I don't think it would be possible until we clearly think through what it is that we hope young people to achieve once they've got past the age of 14 and before they get to 18.
Now, Professor Flew, what do you say to that? What do you also think the impact of Klaus Moser's report, very broadly, is going to be when it comes out on Monday?
Well, I've seen, as other people have seen, only the report in the Daily Mirror on this, and this seems to me a very unfortunate report indeed. Its major recommendations seem to me very misguided indeed. I mean, one that particularly struck me was that the idea one needed to spend up to £4 billion on repairing and improving schools.
What's wrong with that?
Well, this would be a nice thing to do, but his stated reason for wanting this done was that it would reduce truancy. Well, the latest DES study on truancy, which I've had to review, studied the motivation for truancy, and there is not one mention of any truant saying that they didn't want to go to school because the roof was rotten.
One more thing that he also strongly recommends, Klaus Moser, of course, is that education should start effectively at 3 instead of 5. Now, what about that?
Well, it seems to me Patton's response to that is a perfectly good one at the moment.
It's a matter of priority, isn't it?
It's a matter of priorities, and this is to increase the public sector borrowing requirement by another few billion to do that. Seems to me a nonsense.
It seems patently obvious to me that if we wish to lever up educational performance, that we should start learning as early as possible. At the moment, there's differential access to learning. I have a 2-year-old daughter. I know that if she is to go into some sort of nursery education, I'd be buying it. That doesn't actually make it very difficult for me, but certainly makes it difficult for others that aren't in quite such a fortunate position. If we are seriously considering levering up standards for the vast majority of all those that attend school, it seems that we do have to have some equitable provision of resources. That means resourcing equally in such a way that's equally available to all children. If it starts earlier, so much the better. But that principle ought to run throughout education.
Professor Flew, does this talk of going back to basics in social policy, education policy, does it appeal to you, or do you rather agree with David Miliband, who says that it's all, if you start talking about going back to basics, it looks as if you're going right back to the days when the Tories had divisive education policies back in the 50s.
If that's what it means to Miliband, that's a piece of information about Miliband. If you want to know what Conservative ministers mean, I would prefer to attend to what they actually say, and of course...
Well, they talk about going back to basics, not forward, back. That worry you at all?
I mean, in education, it is a desire to ensure that everyone gets the hardcore of abilities as well as others.
There's not a clear direction, is there, to present government policy in relation to education. The national curriculum put together an entitlement curriculum in the late 80s. That's been successfully unpicked in the last 4 years by 3 education secretaries. There's confusion about what's available at post-16. There's not an integration of the systems. There's no... John Patton talks about a blend of routeways post-16 between GMBQ, for example, and A-level. What in fact is being proposed is 2 separate routeways. And I fear that unless there's a comprehensively thought-through 14 to 18 program that allows students to, for example, cash in some of their achievements against academic qualifications and vice versa, will have GMVQ progressively dismissed as the inferior exam, as indeed former exams have gone exactly that way, CPVE, for example. It has to be much more successfully thought through. And in terms of Tony's suggestion that really the environment doesn't matter in education, I've never heard anything so false. I mean, if a roof is falling in, that would certainly bother me as a head teacher, and certainly it would bother me about the school that my daughter attended. There's a direct relationship between the environment and quality of learning.
Well, this was offered as something as a cure for truancy, and it's simply there is no evidence for this being something specific. I mean, obviously, there's a difference of degree in these matters. If the roof is actually falling in and it's a public danger, that's one thing. But this isn't the situation. It's, deferred repairs and that sort of thing.
Professor Flew, Stephen Edwards, I'm afraid we'll leave it there. We have to end there. Thank you both very much indeed. Now for a quick look at some of the day's other news. There was some encouragement for the Chancellor Kenneth Clarke today ahead of his budget at the end of the month. Britain's trade gap with countries outside Europe shrank to £400 million. And industrial output rose by 0.4% after a fall the previous month. The Japanese car manufacturer Nissan is offering voluntary redundancy to the workforce at its factory in Sunderland, Tyne and Wear. The company's recently suffered falling sales. None of the workers is to be made compulsorily redundant. The Press Complaints Commission has suggested toughening its own disciplinary powers after the row over the recently published pictures of Princess Diana exercising. It proposes a dismissing of editors who commit gross breaches of the Commission's code of practice. Sir Richard Body, the Conservative MP for Holland with Boston, has said that he will not be resigning his seat. He announced his decision after meeting the local constituency officers this evening. Sir Richard said that he would reassess his position in 12 months' time. On the markets in London, the 100-share index fell by 1 point to 30.99. In New York, the Dow closed up 23 points at 36.85, and the pound rose slightly against the mark to 2 marks 50 exactly. And in New York, it gained over a cent to close at $1.49.2. Very, very quick look at the headlines of the papers. Top business leaders attacking Tory policy. The Institute of Directors, apparently, wants taxpayers' rebellion. Vicarage rape judge says, I'm sorry, we haven't got time to explore that one. Ram raid ambush on police. Freed to kill. How many more innocents must die? Talking about care in the community scheme. And golly, got me banned. I think we're talking about Dina Newton, the childminder there. That's all from Newsnight tonight. Sorry we can't bring you more details of those papers, but a mixed bag too. We'll be back on Monday, of course, at 10:30. Have a good weekend.
She thinks